Good morrow, one and all. I'm Mr. King, and today we'll be talking about Wilfred Owen's poem, Anthem for Doomed Youth. So, what do you need to know about this poem? Anthem was written by Wilfred Owen, who was a serving First World War soldier. And Owen served from 1915 to 1918, so that's most of the First World War. And the First World War was an atrocious conflict, which claimed the lives of an estimated 40 million people. One of the last people to die in the war was Wilfred Owen himself, who died 7 days before the peace deal was signed which ended the war. Now, before he died, Owen wrote a number of poems which explored the futility, the pointlessness, and the horror of war. He'd seen just how awful it was, and he wanted people to be aware of what the reality of trench warfare was really like. Because before Wilfred Owen was writing poetry, a lot of war poets would celebrate how noble and how glorious war was. But Owen didn't want to do that. He wanted to show people just how hopeless and awful it really is. And in this poem in particular, he talks about what would happen to people when they would die on the battlefield. He says they're slaughtered like cattle. And he talks about all of the funeral rites which they deserve, but which they're not getting. Because war was just so awful that many people, when they were killed, their bodies were never found, or they were killed in a place where their bodies could not be easily recovered. And Owen highlights just how awful it is that people who are fighting for their countries are dying in a pointless war and are not even being honoured appropriately. So in this poem, we see a few key themes. We see the conflict of war and the horror of war. We see just how awful it is for the soldiers and how they become victims of war. And Owen also has a bit of conflict with organised religion in this poem too. There are a few moments where he criticises religious organisations who try to paper over how awful war is and instead promote the pro-war propaganda that war is a noble and glorious thing. So with that in mind, let's have a look at this poem together. So what I'll do now is I will talk about what's going on in this poem and help you work out sort of the story of the poem. But if you feel you've already got a handle on what this poem is about, then do feel free to skip ahead a couple of minutes to the section when I will analyse the language and structure used. For now, what's going on in this poem? So this poem is called Anthem for Doomed Youth, and an anthem is a term used very ironically here, because an anthem is normally a rousing, uplifting song, something which celebrates something perhaps. But here, Owen does not want to celebrate anything in particular. If anything, he wants to make a loud noise to draw readers' attention to just how awful war is. And why is war awful? Well, he tells us in the title. Because all of the youths who go to war are doomed either to die or doomed to suffer in a living hell. And in this poem, we're going to see just why that is. So we begin in the first line by Owen asking what passing bells for these who die as cattle. He says that soldiers are being slaughtered in the millions, and they're being slaughtered like cattle. And when they are killed, what passing bells are rung for them? A passing bell was a bell rung in honour of someone who'd recently died to encourage others to pray for them, but that wasn't happening, simply because people were dying in their millions, and people were dying and not much respect was really being given. The sounds that there were on the battlefield was the monstrous anger of the guns. You could hear the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle, and those noises would patter out, would drown out the sounds of soldiers saying their last and final prayers. So hasty orisons are prayers. Now, one thing Owen does say is when people died, at the very least, there weren't any mockeries. The soldiers weren't mocked. And I think what he had in mind was religious leaders who might give a speech where they might try to say something like, they died gloriously fighting for their country. I mean, don't get me wrong, they did die bravely and they were all heroes fighting for their countries. But Wilfred Owen wants to draw our attention to the fact that their deaths themselves were not often noble or glorious. As we were told in the very first line, they were slaughtered like cattle, and that in itself wasn't particularly glorious. So having some religious leader coming along and saying that it was glorious was simply a mockery and an insult to those who had died. So at least that wasn't going on. But That wasn't going on, but there weren't any prayers either, which would have been nice. There weren't any bells being rung in their honour, and the only choir that these soldiers got was the choir of shells, the sound of artillery shells whining in, and he calls that sound a demented choir of wailing shells, and demented means mad and angry. So as these soldiers are dying, all they can hear is the sound of anger and war and death. And the only other sound that might occasionally be heard was the sound of a bugle in the distance. And the bugle's a really interesting instrument because it was used by the military for lots of different reasons. One way it was used used to encourage soldiers to go over the top and to go into battle. And so as these soldiers are dying, they might hear a bugle just encouraging more soldiers to go to their deaths. The bugle was also played when recruiters would go into towns, into counties like Shropshire, Hampshire, and to encourage new people to join up the army. And so even though soldiers are dying as cattle, you've still got the bugle somewhere else encouraging more people to go and die as cattle, more people to die what Owen seems to think is a relatively pointless death. In the next section, we have the question, what candles may be held to speed them all? Owen's asking who's going to light a candle in honour of these men who are dying on the battlefield. And there's quite a complex image here. He says there aren't going to be candles held in the hands of boys, for example, choir boys in the church, for these people, because they're dying in their millions. So no one's going to do that. The only light that there's going to be is actually the light in the soldiers' eyes, as the light fades from their eyes. So not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The only lights that will be lit for these dying soldiers are the light in their eyes as they pass away. And that helps us realize that the word boys is not talking about an altar boy somewhere else lighting a candle in honour of the departed soldiers. Instead, the boys are the soldiers who are dying, and that just highlights how vulnerable they are and how horrific war really is. Later on, Owen talks about the only pall they will get is the pallor of girls' brows. So a pallor is an unhealthy pale appearance, and a pall is a cloth, maybe a flag, that's put over a coffin. And here Owen is saying that the dying soldiers are not going to get a pall put over their coffin. The only thing they're going to get are girls back home worrying about them. That's the only honour they might get. The only flowers they're going to get, metaphorically, are the patient minds of people who are waiting eagerly and hoping that the men are going to come back home. And each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds at the end. In the First World War, mourning families would often close their blinds for privacy while they're grieving, while they're mourning. And the fact that he ends up saying each slow dusk there's a drawing down of blinds is a reminder that every night more and more families are mourning as they hear the news that their relatives have been killed in war. And it's a very sombre note to end the poem on, because it's a reminder of just how horrific and brutal war really is. So let's begin by looking at the language and structure of this poem, and I will only be picking out a few key things because there's just so much in this poem that I could spend a 2-hour lecture talking about it, and I'm not going to do that. So here are some of the key highlights, and I want to begin by thinking about the form of this poem. You might recognise the form of this poem. It has 14 lines. It has a regular rhyme scheme: cattle rhymed with rattle, guns, orisons, bells, shells, choirs, shires, etc. And it ends with a rhyming couplet: mines rhymes with blinds. And all of this, a 14-line poem with a regular rhyme scheme ending with a rhyming couplet, this is the form of a sonnet. And a sonnet is usually a love poem. Why has Owen written this poem about war in the form of a sonnet? Well, I would suggest he's done it ironically, in the same way that the word anthem in the title was used ironically. A sonnet form would normally imply that something is lovely, but here Owen is implying that nothing is lovely about war. So the sonnet form is used ironically just to highlight how war is not lovely. You would expect in this form to find beautiful things, but instead we don't find anything beautiful. And this just highlights the ugliness and the horror of war. So let's begin with the language in the first sentence. Owen asks, what passing bells for these who die as cattle? So he's rhetorically asking, who's going to ring a passing bell for the soldiers who are dying? And he knows the answer to that question. He knows the answer is that very few soldiers are getting passing bells rung for them. So this rhetorical question, combined with the furious tone, expresses Owen's frustration that soldiers are not being treated with more respect. And this idea that soldiers are not being treated with respect is reinforced by the dehumanizing simile. They're dying as cattle. The soldiers are compared to animals being taken to the slaughterhouse to be killed. A cow has very little control or power over what happens to it, and in the same way, the soldiers have very little control or power over what happens to them. So we see Owen's furious contempt with those who send soldiers to die such horrible deaths. We then move to the sounds that can be heard on the battlefield. We hear the monstrous anger of the guns. We hear the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle. And in these lines, the weapons are personified. So the guns have a monstrous anger, and the rifles are stuttering away. And by using this technique of personification, the weapons are given human-like characteristics. And this is really interesting because in the previous line, in line 1, we were told that the soldiers were dehumanized. They were being treated like cattle. And this contrast is really significant because if soldiers are being treated so badly, if they're being taken to battlefields to be slaughtered like cattle, then that means that all of the humanity is being driven out of the soldiers. And by comparison, the most human-seeming thing on the battlefield are the weapons, and that's just utterly ridiculous. So the personification here of the weapons draws attention to the fact that they seem the most human thing on the battlefield because so much humanity has been driven out of the soldiers who are forced to die like cattle. Furthermore, the personification makes these weapons seem even more terrifying, and that highlights the horror of war. The guns seem to have a monstrous anger. It feels like you're fighting against an angry monster. And the rifles, which are stuttering away, it creates an overwhelmingly terrifying effect as we imagine those bullets firing at the soldiers and just how terrifying that must have been for them. The contrast between the noise of the guns drowning out the hasty orisons, drowning out the final prayers of dying soldiers, further reinforces the fact that soldiers are being treated very poorly, that humans are being ignored, and that this highlights the horror of war, that the sound of gunfire is the sound that we can hear. What we can't hear is the voice of humanity. And Owen really wants to draw attention to the fact that we need to hear the voice of humanity, because in this time of war, there was so much evil and inhumanity going on. Now, these lines here are just so interesting if you want to analyze them from a sound techniques perspective. So first of all, we've got onomatopoeia. So the words rattle, stuttering, patter, all of these words are onomatopoeic. So the use of onomatopoeia and the fact that we've got 3 examples within 2 lines, it exaggerates just how noisy and how overwhelming and how chaotic the battlefield is. And that effect that war is overwhelming is reinforced by Owen's use of consonants. So just listen to these lines really carefully as I read them out. Only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. Just listen carefully again for that R sound and that T sound. Only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. We've got that R sound and that T sound repeated again and again. And I would argue that that R and T sound, which is repeated, mirrors the sound of gunfire on the battlefield. Just throughout that line, stuttering rifles, rapid rattle, it sounds like a gun is rattling away. And that use of consonants combined with the onomatopoeia creates a sense that we can experience the noise and chaos and war. It's almost like the chaos of war wants to leave the poem and come to us as human beings who are reading the poem, so we can get some glimmer of what the war was really like. This sound imagery makes war seem very overwhelming. Moving on, we then, having had this section with the noise of the battlefield, we then have a contrast between that noise and the silence for the mourners. There's, while there's the guns are rattling, and while the guns are angrily firing out, there's no sound of prayers, there's no sound of bells, there's no voice of mourning. So the contrast between the noise of war and the silence for the mourners shows that something is wrong. We should be making noise for the people who have died. We should be mourning, we should be grieving, but that's not happening. And the fact that that is not happening shows that something is fundamentally wrong. And so the contrast between the noise of war and the silence for the mourners implies that our priorities are the wrong way around, and that we should be making more noise, and we should be honouring the heroes who have died on the battlefield. And I mentioned earlier, when I'm talking about the key themes, that Owen doesn't just highlight the horror of war, although we can see here how awful war is through the anger of the guns and through how brutal war is. And we can also see how soldiers are victimized. We've talked about how the soldiers are like cattle, but we also see in this line the sort of criticism of religion, the fact that he says there's no mockeries for them. This is Owen explaining that at least there's no religious organization trying to use soldiers' deaths for propaganda purposes. And here we have a subtle criticism of religion. But I've already said about that. If you want to hear more about that, go back to the Story of the Poem section where I talked about that earlier. After the silence of the mourners, there's no voice of mourning. We end by being told that at least there's a choir, and briefly we might go, oh great, at least there's a choir there to honour and celebrate the lives of these soldiers, until we realise that the choirs are not men and women singing beautifully. Instead, the choirs are the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells. So that beautiful image of a choir is subverted, which means something good is made really awful. So the image of a choir is subverted as we learn that it's the choir of wailing shells. And that's an awful image. The noise of artillery shells, that whine, that shrill wail is terrifying. And the onomatopoeia of a shrill and wailing makes the conflict seem even more atrocious. I mean, even the artillery shells are wailing. That's how awful it is. So the personification of the shells and the verb wailing. And the fact that the choirs are described as demented. I mean, that word has that adjective has connotations of mad and anger, and the fact that even the shells are mad and angry and have gone mad implies that there's something fundamentally wrong with war. And the fact that Owen has taken quite a beautiful image, the image of a choir, and he's subverted it and corrupted it and made it a choir of wailing shells, shows that war can ruin even the best of things. War just makes humanity less good. So we see just how perverse and how corrupted and how destructive war is through this image. And then just finally we end with a bit more sound imagery. We end with this oral imagery of bugles calling for more soldiers from sad shires. And it's not clear why the shires are sad. Are the shires sad because the soldiers have died? Almost certainly. Are the shires sad because they're having to send even more soldiers to the front line? Almost certainly also. And so this image at the end of this stanza, at the end of this section, implies that War is very circular. We begin in the first line with soldiers dying as cattle. We end this stanza with bugles calling for more people to go to the front line, presumably to die as cattle. So it's almost like a circular structure to this stanza, implying that war is a repetitive, ongoing cycle, which is appalling and atrocious. Owen begins the second stanza in the same way that he'd begun his first stanza, with another frustrated rhetorical question. And here he asks what candles are going to be lit to honour those who have died. And Owen sort of knows that we could never do enough to honour the sacrifices of those who died in the First World War. He knows that not enough can be done. But unlike the first rhetorical question, in this example, he actually gives an answer to his own question. And he suggests that there is some kind of light being lit to honour these boys, in a way, but it's not the way we might expect. He says candles are not being held in the hands of boys. So if you're imagining altar boys in a church somewhere lighting candles to honour these soldiers, that's not happening. But there is some kind of light shining for them, but it's light in their eyes. It's the light in soldiers' eyes, which is glimmering as the light fades from their eyes and as they die. And this is a really haunting image, the image of the only candles that are being really lit for these dying soldiers. It's the light in their own eyes as they die. It's a really haunting image, and it implies that not enough is being done to honour these soldiers, if that's really the only form of respect that Owen can think of on the front lines that's being given to these soldiers, and that's clearly just not enough. We then move into a few different images showing all that the soldiers are going to get when they have died. And so we begin line 12 with Owen pointing out that many soldiers won't even get a pall on their coffins. Many of them won't get a cloth or a flag draped over their coffins, simply because so many millions were dying. The only thing they might get is girls back home worrying about them. And here we see some interesting wordplay. Owen plays with the word pall. So pall is that cloth or flag which might go over a coffin. And there's wordplay with the word pall and pallor. So those two words linked together. The only pall they might get is the pallor of girls' brows. The only thing they might get is girls back home worrying about their loved ones, looking pale and concerned. We also see in the next line that they're unlikely to get flowers. The only flowers, metaphorically, that they might get are patient minds back home thinking tender thoughts about the soldiers out at war. And those are the only flowers they might get. And they're metaphorical flowers. The patient thoughts are metaphorically flowers. And that's the only kind of flowers that these soldiers might receive. And then we end with a historical allusion. And each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds, and an allusion is just a reference to a historical event. And in this case, the historical reference is to the fact that in the First World War, when the news eventually did arrive that a loved one had died, quite often the families would close their blinds so they could grieve in private. And so you might walk through a town in the evening and see many different houses with their blinds closed. And that would just be a sign that so many men have died fighting in the war. The drawing down of blinds could also metaphorically symbolise eyelids closing. The blinds could be sort of eyelids closing in grief as people scrunch up their faces and they start to weep and grieve and mourn those who have died. So we end this poem on a very sombre, very mournful note. We see in this poem how soldiers have been treated inhumanely. They are treated like cattle taken to slaughter. The most human thing on the battlefield, ironically, is the guns and the rifles and the shells. They have more humanity than the dead bodies on the battlefield. and the acts of mourning that are being done are deeply insufficient. We have girls back home anxiously thinking about their loved ones at war. We have people thinking tender thoughts, but that's really all that can be done. I mean, how can you, as a society, respond to the murder of millions of people? It's just something so difficult to get your head around. And Owen, through this poem, expresses that just not enough is being done to honour these fallen heroes, although it does raise the question, what could ever be enough to honour these fallen heroes? And that therefore quite naturally takes our thoughts to, why were these men sent to war in the first place? And thus it can be seen as a deep criticism of those who send people to war. It implies that war is deeply inhumane and should not be permitted and should not be allowed. So I hope you have found that a really useful exploration of this poem. If you do have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below and I can try to address them for you. If you found these videos helpful, please do let me know if you'd like any more videos like this, and please do hit those like and subscribe buttons. And I think for now we will leave it there. So until next time, cheerio.